For the Aztecs, warfare was much more of a ritual that was linked to their religious worship. So they tried to capture the more exalted and honored members of their opposing society, and these captives, they would take back to their city where they would be kept and then ritually sacrificed when the time came.
The Aztecs were known to keep their victims prisoner for months. For the conquistadors and their entourage, the wait must have seemed interminable. The conditions would have been wretched. Little food, little light, and the growing certainty of incomprehensible horrors to come. The Spanish had no basis for understanding human sacrifice as anything other than an agonizing and barbaric way to die. But for the Aztecs, the ritual was a necessity for survival. To them, sacrifice was not a form of punishment, but the ultimate opportunity to do one's part for the perpetuation of the universe. The spectacular city of Teotihuacan was one of the Aztec centers of human sacrifice. The magnificent temples and pyramids were all built in devotion to the gods. Each year, hundreds of thousands of visitors would flock to the city to pay tribute to the deities. Teotihuacan was known as the City of Gods. It would have made a stunning backdrop for the sacrificial ceremonies.
Human sacrifice was very important to the Aztecs because they believed that without it, the gods would go unnourished and the world would come to an end.
Each of the temples lining the avenue was dedicated to an individual god. There were gods for each season and for important festivals in the Aztec calendar. Every god was connected to some aspect of the natural world. They required frequent offerings in their honor. The Aztecs presented food and animals, but the ultimate gift was the sacrifice of a human life.
According to myth, the gods gather here at Teotihuacan to create the sun and the moon. Everything was in darkness. It was necessary for the gods to sacrifice themselves. In order to do that, they had to throw themselves into a huge fire. In turn, men had to do the same. They had to sacrifice themselves to keep giving that precious nourishment, those precious hearts, in order to have the sun moving, in order to have the cosmos in balance.
The entire Aztec world revolved around this need. Human sacrifice was required to keep their world turning. One by one, living victims would be brought before the priests. The actual death blow was forcefully abrupt. It was crucial for the severed heart to remain beating as it was offered up to the gods.
What, of course, is very difficult for us to understand culturally is what human sacrifice was all about and how it took place and why it was acceptable. Because, of course, to us, human sacrifice seems the most unacceptable of all kind of activities. It's very difficult to look at that in a very kind of realistic way, but certainly the Aztec concept of the world and their understanding of the universe and their right to live in it, to participate in it, was based on the sacrifice of the gods themselves.
Cortez witnessed the bloody ritual with his own eyes. He recorded every graphic detail of the ceremony in his letters.
They take many girls and boys, and even adults, and in the presence of the idols, they open their chest while they're still alive and take out their hearts and entrails and burn them before the idols. offering the smoke as sacrifice.
What Cortez didn't see was that his own abandoned people were receiving the same treatment. Back in Zultepec, the Spanish had become the latest offering to the Aztec gods.
This is where they carried out the sacrifices of their captives. Here they suspended people held by 4 priests. They removed the heart and offered it up to the sun.
The sacrifices were only performed by specially trained priests who were adept with both the ritual and the knife. This was their sacrificial altar.
The victim was laid out on the platform. 4 priests were at the back holding each limb, and a 5th priest would actually insert a knife, cut the chest open, tear the heart out, and offer it to the sun. The heart was placed on a sacred vessel, and then the vessel was brought down the steps. The victim sometimes was rolled down the steps, and priests were receiving the victim at the bottom of the temple. When the heart was taken out and it was offered up to the sun, to the god, it was the most precious of all the offerings humans could give to the gods. We know that this very stone witnessed each and every sacrifice at the temple.
The altar stone remains, and Enrique has even discovered a blade that might have been used in the ceremonies.
This is the only sacrificial knife that has been found in this ceremonial area.
The knife was made of flint, with an edge sharp enough to cut through a human chest in a single plunge.
It had a special box, so it was kept and safeguarded every time it was used for human sacrifice.
The ritual was carefully orchestrated. All the sacrifices at Zultepec took place high on the Temple Mount. Only the priests took part in the ceremony itself. But once the killing was over and the human offering had been made, the macabre remains were put on show for the general public to see.
They have pieced together this timber rack to reflect what the original Tzompantli would have looked like. Tzompantli is the Aztec word for a skull rack. Once the victims were sacrificed to the gods, their heads were hung here like trophies.
In preparation for being displayed, each head was punctured through the left and right temple.
The skull rack was an altar which normally was placed in front of the main temples. These skulls could have been placed on these beams like beads on a necklace.
More than 24 of these pierced skulls were found at Zultepec. At least half of them were of European origin. The mutilated Spanish remains provided a clear picture of what befell this unfortunate band of conquistadors. The next step for Elizabeth is to see if she can find any historical records that corroborate the physical evidence. The place to go for such records is back in Mexico City. The Library of Anthropology houses priceless and beautiful codices, painted books that document Aztec stories. Most of the manuscripts that still exist were created by early Spanish settlers, but many of these are based on older Aztec pictograms.
that has, well, Florentine Codex has 3 volumes, but there are several scenes of sacrifice.
Historian Carmen Aguilera has some interesting images for Elizabeth to see.
So, which one are you going to show me first?
Well, I think the Florentine picture, because it's very illustrative of how 16th century people represented human sacrifice. Here we have a picture of sacrifice by taking out the heart of the captive.
This simple ink drawing, penned by a European scribe not long after the conquest, clearly depicts an Aztec sacrifice of a local victim. But what Elizabeth wants is any references to the sacrifice of Spaniards. Carmen can't go back to the original codices, which are kept in temperature-controlled vaults to keep them from disintegrating.
His first publication after 500 years.
But she does have facsimiles of the important works and thinks she knows just where to look for entries about the Spanish.
This is the 12th book of the Florentine Codex.
Buried within this 500-page tomb is an illustration that until now has never truly caught Carmen's attention.
See?
Yes.
Oh, you found it. Instead of showing the heads of the Indians, it shows horses' heads and human heads.
This tiny, crude illustration contains 2 important clues. First is the horse heads on the skull rack. The Aztecs didn't have horses, so they must have been captured from the conquistadors. But even more telling is the depiction of the human heads on the rack. They are heavily bearded. Since the locals had little facial hair, the beards were a defining characteristic of the Spanish soldiers. For Elizabeth, this is just the corroborating evidence she has been looking for. It's a direct link between the historical records and the Zultepec bones. But not all her questions have been answered by the codices. In the fleeting but tempestuous period of Spanish invasion and Aztec uprising, had there been more to the sacrifices than religious tradition? Warfare expert Ross Hassig believes the Aztecs may have had political motives for sacrificing their enemies.
It's painted as religious, but in fact it was being used for political purposes. And the primary purpose of this was to solidify the empire.
It's well documented that the Aztec warriors terrorized their weaker neighbors and governed their empire with intimidation and fear. They exacted heavy taxes from their subjects and gave them little freedom. Not surprisingly, the Aztecs flourished under this system. But they also worked hard to consolidate and maintain their power. And that, says Ross, is where the other purpose of human sacrifice came in.
When they had an opportunity, the Aztecs would take captives and make a public display of them. They actually took the skin off the face and their hands, tanned it, and sent it around to a lot of these wavering cities. The whole purpose of this kind of display of a sacrifice and display is to intimidate your friends and your enemies. And so the Aztecs would have killed these people publicly, displayed their remains publicly as a way of ensuring the loyalty and fealty of a lot of towns that may have been wavering in their support.
Could this have been the motive behind the massacre at Zultepec?
It maybe really was this incident in 1520 where they had all these Spaniards and they were able to sacrifice them at leisure, display them publicly without fear of any reprisals, and then send these materials around to a lot of their allies.
One can only wonder if Cortez and his men in Tenochtitlan caught wind of what was happening to their brethren in Zultepec. If they did, it would have been a chilling warning that at a time of escalating violence between the Aztecs and the conquistadors. What we do know is that Cortés did not stay in Tenochtitlan for long after the death of Moctezuma. With the city in chaos, he was forced to retreat. The Spanish in Zultepec didn't have that option. And further examination of their bones is revealing that their desecration continued even after death. The unfortunate victims had been captured, imprisoned, sacrificed to the Aztec gods, and dismembered. Their still beating hearts had been ripped from their chests. And now there is evidence they were eaten as well.
También te voy a mostrar lo que son las máscaras de piedra.
Enrique Martinez's storeroom contains thousands of artifacts found at Zultepec. He has obsidian blades and rare pottery burial pots. Everything has been carefully sorted and cataloged.
Son muy importantes por eso.
Sí, nos están revelando su grupo étnico.
One of Enrique's most prized relics is a stone chamber that was used to hold human hearts during the ritual sacrifices. But even among all these priceless treasures, it is the bones that provide the most information about the massacre. Whole skeletons tell one story, but individual bones tell another. Once the captives had been sacrificed, their bodies were dismembered and ritually prepared. The long bones were given to the warriors as trophies. At first, they had to be stripped of flesh and treated.
They put the remains in lime to stop them from putrefying, and eventually they would be displayed in people's houses.
Other bones appear to have been cooked at high temperatures.
Some of the bones have been cremated. They would have been put directly on top of the fire.
The preparation of all these bones suggests that the sacrificial killing was just step one, followed by cooking and eating.
As well as being ingested, the bone has been chewed and eaten too, bit by bit. This is another characteristic that you will notice in the preparation of these bones.
They display all the hallmarks of having been cooked and consumed.
We can see some of the marks. These marks actually are of human beings when the person chewed the bone. And we know that the marrow was ritually eaten. It was taken out and eaten.
Historians have long suspected that the Aztecs indulged in cannibalism. But according to Enrique, this is the first time that actual archaeological evidence has been found to back up the claim. Once again, the discoveries at Zultepec are corroborated by illustrations in the Aztec codices. This time, it's eerie images of Aztec warriors cooking and devouring their enemies.
There were also rituals in which human flesh was eaten. Now, whether this was done to strike dread into the hearts of the Spanish, or whether it was done because the Aztecs felt that it might drain the power of the Spaniards, or maybe they felt very strong upset the gods, and the only way that they could appease them would be to offer the highest form of sacrifice, which would be to capture a Spaniard or his horse and sacrifice it, is open to question. But certainly, sacrifice of Spaniards did occur.
At long last, the full story of the massacre at Zultepec has been wrestled from the bones. What began as a bold foray into the New World by a band of Spaniards ended in a bloody execution that defied their European comprehension. With 21st century hindsight, the episode sheds new light on the confrontation between the Aztecs and the conquistadors.
In my opinion, it is certainly a good time to reconsider this important chapter in the history of the conquest of Mexico.
The widely accepted view is that the conquistadors took on the mighty Aztec nation and brought down their empire with little resistance. But this history, of course, has been written by the victors. The truth is not as clear-cut. After fleeing from the Aztec uprising in Tenochtitlan, Cortez and his men regrouped. But it took 2 long years before they finally conquered the Aztecs. By then, Cortez was back in the Spanish king's good graces and was appointed governor of the new territory. In his new role, he demolished the great Aztec capital and laid the foundations for what is today Mexico City. His metropolis soon became a beacon of European influence in the Americas. The Aztec resistance was all but forgotten until the ruins at Zultepec provided some balance to the history.
I think it's important because it tells an aspect of the story that is not often told. One of those really is to perhaps lay bare the myth that the Spaniards just simply moved in and the Aztecs rolled over and, if you like, just gave up. Because we know that they didn't. They fought hard.
There can now be little doubt that the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire was a bloody affair for both sides. Each nation relied on its own tactics, traditions, and beliefs. The Spaniards eventually triumphed, but at least at Zultepec, there is definitive archaeological proof that the Aztecs fought back.
Is provided by